Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Let's begin talking through Chapter 3. So, Chapter 3 is about ecosystems and the basic idea of what ecology is. And so, here's your definition of ecology. And so, we need to keep this in mind as we go forward. This class is really about ecology. It's about studying the connections in nature. So, we need to understand those connections in nature. We have to understand how things interact with each other. And then we need to understand how we interact with those items as well. They could be living or non-living things within the environment and how those things interplay. The Borneo story that you read in class the other day is a good example of this idea of trying to understand the interconnections of organisms or the understanding of ecology so we can understand how we're affecting it. The first piece of that is to understand what an organism is. So, organisms are individual forms of life, and we classify them into what we call a species to begin with. And so we've all heard of what a species is, and the key to understand when it comes to a species is this part right down here. Is something a species with another thing? Like dogs, for instance, are species. There's different breeds of dog, but they all belong to the same species. Deer, mule deer and white-tailed deer, for instance, are not of the same species. How can I tell the difference between the two? So when a set of individuals mate that can mate and produce, this is the key, viable, fertile offspring, okay? Which means they have to have babies, and those babies have to be able to have babies. And if you don't get that, we don't consider them the same species. So white-tailed deer and mule deer, for instance, can have babies with each other, but those babies are sterile. Donkeys and horses, they can have what we call a mule. A mule, again, is sterile, so they're not of the same species. But dogs can mate with other dogs and produce viable mutt offspring, and so they're of the same species, just different breeds within that species. So we really need to know that definition. Based on that definition, of course, we have identified 1.75 million species on this planet, which is a significant number, but this line right here is an indication of how far we have left to go. So we estimate between 5 to almost 10 times as many species actually are out there that we haven't had a chance to identify. Now, we've identified most of the big macro species out there, but not all of the little teeny tiny different variations of ants or bees or bacteria or whatever it may be. And so we have a lot of unidentified species that are out there. Species in the rainforest, places that are hard to get to at the bottom of the ocean. There's lots of places where we just don't know very much about yet, and we have to learn. Of that 1.75 million and or the 10 to 14 million, most of those bad boys are insects. Insects are some of the most widely diverse creatures on the planet. There are thousands of species of ants, hundreds of species of bumblebees. So insects are very diverse, and so they are a rich source of what we call biodiversity, which is coming up here in our next conversation. What we need to be careful of, and I think what the story of Borneo illustrates to us, is we as humans identify things as pests. Many times we classify specific insects as pests or problems because they're interfering with something that's working in our lives. They could be competing for food that we're trying to eat. They're eating the same food source. They could be spreading disease like the malaria mosquitoes in Borneo. They could just be annoying, stinging, biting kind of things. And they could just be a general nuisance. And so we classify them as pests. And usually when we do that, we want to eradicate or get rid of them, and we make steps to have that happen. But it's important to keep in mind, just because we label them as pests doesn't mean they don't play a beneficial role that we need to understand within society. And so as many of those things that you might label as pests exist out there, keep in mind that many of those are very beneficial. You might consider a mosquito a pest, but it does pollinate. They eat other insects in many cases, like a ladybug. Now, most people don't consider a ladybug a pest, but nonetheless, it eats other bugs, for instance. There's a picture of one right there that is the same thing. They reset the soil for us to grow stuff with. And so they play important roles in the world. We estimate that about $57 billion a year in ecological services are provided by insects. That's a huge number and a really important thing, and they're a fundamental component of the way our system works, helping producers produce, keeping other species in check, feeding other species. And so when we label things as pests and try to get rid of them, we have to understand the greater implications. From a species, you work your way up to a population. A population is all of a group of organisms that live in the same area that are the same species. That interact in a specific place. So all the polar bears in the North Pole, near the North Pole, all the deer that live in the Bighorn Mountains, all the fish that hang out on the Great Barrier Reef. These are examples of a population. The population isn't a worldwide population, it's a population for a specific region, which brings us to this term right here, habitat, which you guys all well know. That's where the animals live. It's the place they exist. And so we need to just know those terms as we move forward. This term right here maybe is one that you haven't seen as much as you've seen other ones, genetic diversity. In this class, this one matters a lot. The reason why it matters is it is the best indicator of the health of an ecosystem. Ecosystems that have greater amounts of biodiversity usually are healthier and more stable than the ones that have low biodiversity. For instance, Arctic tundra, not very much biodiversity there. And so when we start to play with the organisms in that location, it has a tremendous impact on all the other organisms in the area, and it's much more likely to collapse as a result of slight changes. Places with great genetic diversity have a tendency to thrive a little more, and they can handle those kind of transitions in climate or weather or all those other factors that could exist and make those things happen better. So genetic diversity is the amount of genetic differences that exist. And this picture illustrates right here that idea. These are all the same species of shell, but you can see the great amount of variation within them. Humans are the same way. We're all almost identical in every single way under the sun. We have very small differences that allow us to be very genetically diverse, and that creates for hardier species. Moving on from that, there's another term you need to know, which is right here, a community. So now we know all the population that's in a specific location. And so now what we want to do is we want to talk about, oops, I got excited and got ahead of myself a little bit there. I apologize. Let me fix that. Boom, there it is. So a community is all of the different populations that live in a place. So if you look at buffalo, it's all the cottonwoods and the deer and the rabbits, everything that lives within the town of Buffalo would be the community of living creatures here. If you take that into consideration and then you add in all those physical environmental things like all the abiotic factors such as wind and water and soil and all that kind of stuff, the physical environment is added into the community, then you come up with an ecosystem. And so you need to know those two things, and if you put all the ecosystems together on the planet, you have yourself the biosphere, which is basically a global ecosystem. It's the whole living and things that interact with living things on the planet. So that's section 1 of chapter 3. Go ahead and get your notes done. Appreciate it. Bye.